Okay, so hello everyone. Today we're going to be examining a text that is not very well known that tells the rather shocking backstory of the famed disciple, Judas Iscariot, disciple of Christ, who famously betrayed him for 30 silvers, renounced the silvers, threw them back at the Sanhedrin according to the Gospel of Matthew, and then suicided via hanging. Uh, and of course, in the book of Acts, there's an interesting account whereby it seems he didn't die from that hanging, but rather purchased a plot of land on which his guts exploded. And we'll get to an extra biblical early Christian source, namely ascribed to a certain apostolic father called St. Papias, which describes the exact nature of his end and reconciles those two seemingly conflicting biblical accounts. But what we're going to be looking at today instead is a rather peculiar document. I'll be reading directly from a manuscript that is medieval from Mt Athos, and we'll get to that shortly. But the tale told in this medieval manuscript about the origins of Judas Iscariot, about his childhood and how he came to become a disciple of Christ, is a rather interesting one. It includes tales of him slaying his own father unbeknownst to him and ultimately copulating with his own mother, much like the famed story of Oedipus, right, told perhaps most famously by the tragedian Sophocles, where he slays his own father, solves the riddle of the Sphinx, becomes king of Thebes, and ends up marrying the queen of the dead king, i.e. his own mother, rather famously. So that general typology is, in short, what we will be seeing in this text about Judas Iscariot's life. Now, the text comes from the manuscript itself, which I'll be doing a live translation from into English from the original ancient Greek. The manuscript was found in this monastery on Mount Athos, northern Greece, the holy mountain of the Eastern Orthodox, specifically in the monastery of St. Dionysius the Areopagite, who, if you don't know, was a pagan Platonist philosopher who was converted by St. Paul. We get the account in the book of Acts of St. Paul's preaching on the Areopagus, on this mount under the Acropolis, where he promulgated that the unknown God that was being worshipped on an altar close to that site was in fact the Logos, Jesus Christ. And he quotes ancient authors like Epimenides and Aratus of Soli in order to make his case for the Christian God to these pagan Greek philosophers, which is all very interesting. That's where this manuscript comes from. And the reason I include this painting here of the Nile with the pyramids and baby Moses in a wicker basket being adopted by the Pharaoh's daughter is because, as we're going to see in this tale about Judas Iscariot's origins, he too was placed in a box on the waters as a baby in much the same way. Indeed, it's quite a common motif. Sargon of Akkad, the famous king of old, also had such a story about his infancy, that he was placed in a box and set in the waters. And of course, it's typologically similar to Moses in the ark during the cosmic flood. It's kind of a symbol of new beginnings. In Moses's case, new beginnings for the better, but as we'll see in Judas Iscariot's case, the beginnings of destruction, for he's the son of perdition. So let's dive straight into the text and you'll see what I mean. So here it is. I'm going to be translating from this manuscript from the monastery of St. Dionysius the Areopagite on Mount Athos. It's medieval text about Judas Iscariot. So the title is Concerning the Lawless Judah. And the text begins with a peculiar phrase. One of the wise men once said, and then it begins after that intro. One of the wise men once said that there was a lawless Judah who was from the country of Iscariot, from the tribe of the Judeans, from the tribe of the Jews, the tribe of Judah. And there was unto him a father named Robel. And this Robel had a wife, and one night she dreamed a most frightful dream, and she became quite shocked, and with a great fear, she began to cry out. And her husband came to her and said, "What has befallen you, O my wife? Why are you so distressed?" And she said, "I dreamed a terrible dream, that I will conceive and give birth to a male child, and that this child will be the destruction of the Jews." And her husband rebuked her on account of her believing in dreams. But nonetheless, the woman conceived and she gave birth to a male child. Right, so she conceived in that very night, the text says. And after the according time, she gave birth to a male child. And the woman wanted to destroy this child so that the whole tribal race of the Jews would not be destroyed. And so, unbeknownst to her husband, separately in secret, she created a wicker basket. The same word is used in the Septuagint for Moses's box when he's a baby and he's placed in the Nile. Right? So she creates a wicker basket and she casts it into the sea. For across from Iscariot, there was a small island in which there dwelt people who reared animals, and the wicker basket arrived in this place by means of the waves, and taking it, they found therein a male child, and they gave it suck from the milk of the animals, namely, presumably sheep and goats, and they named him Judah or Judas because they presumed that he was from the Judeans, from the tribe of Judah. And so when he was weaned, i.e., when he stopped consuming milk, they brought him to Iscariot through the strait that was between this place and the sea. And they asked, who will rear this child? And Robel came, that is the actual father of the child, and he took the child not knowing that it was his. He was very beautiful. He was very seasonally comely in appearance, Horeos. And the mother loved the child very much, remembering the infant which she had cast into the sea. So again, she doesn't know that there's actually one and the same child. And she then conceived and birthed yet another son, and she reared the two children together with one spirit. But Judas was evil, and he struck his brother. And so many times his mother would teach him, or teach them both, saying, "Oh, my child, stop, do not strike him, for he happens to be your brother. And all the things that I and your father have are for both of you, are for the two of you, the inheritance, that is." But nonetheless, being an evil branch, so to speak, that is like sprouting plant, being an evil sprout on account of his love of money, he conceived of a great jealousy, and he planned to kill his own brother, Judas, that is. And so one day, when the two of them, the two children, were going to a certain place, Judas rose up and killed his brother with a stone upon the temple, and the brother died. And after this, he, the slayer, Judas, left for Jerusalem. He left Iscariot. And since he loved money, he became known unto Herod, the king of the Judeans. And since the king saw that he, Judah, was now a young man who was capable and had that a comely and seasonally beautiful appearance, he made him in charge of his business, his buying and selling, and all the things that were necessary in the agora, in the marketplace. And so after quite some time, there was a revolt, and there were scandals in the agora of Ascara. And so Rebel took his wife and all of his possessions, and he came to Jerusalem, for he was quite wealthy. And so he bought lovely housing close to that of Herod, and he had walled gardens, right? Paradisus, paradis desoi, right? Paradises are literally walled gardens. It's a Persian word. Para is like Greek peri, meaning around, and the des part means like wall, related to Greek tekos, which is wall. So these walled gardens, these paradises, and as we're going to see, there's certainly a connection typologically to the paradise, the walled garden of Eden, as we're going to see with the forbidden fruit motif, not to give much away yet. So Robel comes with his wife and all his possessions, buys up land and acquires these walled gardens, which have inside them many trees, fruit trees. And Judas, after much time, did not recognize his father or his mother, and nor did they recognize him. And one day, the king, that is Herod, was leaning out through a window and looking over the walled garden, the paradise of Rebel. And Judas stood with him and said to the king, "Do you wish, O king, O Lord, to receive from the flourishings of these trees, such that I might go down and take from them?" And so he went down through the window and he took as many of the fruits as he wanted. But as he was doing so, his father, Robel, came out and encountered him. And he said to him, "Why, O young man, how can you dare to come into my walled garden when I'm not here, and so much so to even take my fruits?" But he, being bold and raw or crude, he stood against him, against Robel, and looking this way and that way and seeing that nobody was about, he slayed him, that is his own father, unbeknownst to him, with a rock, just as he killed his own brother. And he did not know it. And so he brought the fruits to the king, and he narrated to him the death of Robel. And hearing this, he was greatly saddened, but nonetheless he kept silent and buried Robel. And after these things, the king said to Judas, I seek, I wish, I plot to have this widow, either for you to take her as your wife, so that you can become an inheritor of her inheritance. That is what I plan. And so Herod sent him with an excuse, right, to say to her the following: my kingdom wishes to be yoked to another man, or for your wealth to come upon the kingdom. That is to say, in plain English, that it's the kingdom's intention to appropriate your property if you do not marry another man. So she's being pressured to marry in order to preserve property, or else her property will be annexed. Presumably, there's an assumption that, as a woman, you're not a spinster widow woman, you're not capable of managing the property alone. And so when the woman heard these words, she obeyed and sought to take a husband, so that her riches would not come to naught, would not be destroyed. And so she actually took her own son as a husband, that is Judas, not knowing that it was so. And she birthed sons with him. and they went together in one spirit for many years. And then one day, when she came to herself, the woman was remembering all the many things which she had suffered on account of her children and her husband and his bitter death. And she was crying and lamenting in a most woeful manner. And she was lamenting the fact that she had taken a husband, another husband, even though she did not wish it to be so. And her husband, whom we said was Judas, asked her, what is this lamentation and this wailing about? And when she was forced, the woman began to narrate in great detail all the evil things which had befallen her. And she spoke of how she cast her son into the sea, and she spoke of the people who were shepherds of Judah and how they took in the child from the sea. And she again spoke about the death of the brother and of Robel. And by the way, in case it was ambiguous, the reason I put Cain and Abel here, obviously from these mosaics from Sicily, is because of the fratricidal element of Judas's story, right? Much like Cain, he kills his brother. And that icon here with the empty halo and the devil on the shoulder is the scene that shows Iscariot departing from the Last Supper and to go and betray Christ, right? And he loses his sainthood under the influence of the devil. Okay, so back to the story now from this medieval text telling the backstory of Judas Iscariot. So when he, i.e. Judas, heard these things from his mother, who just revealed the truth, he said to her, I am your son, whom you cast into the sea, and I slayed my own brother and my father, Robel. I did all of these things. And when the woman heard this, that it was her son, she wished to die a bitter death. And crying out, she said, woe is me, oh, this wretch that I am. Where can I hide? Where can I flee to? Whence can I flee this threat and this rage, this wrath of God? For no more is there anything for us, she says. Right, we're over, she says. And when Judas heard these evils, all these evils which his desire for silver, for money, had caused or provoked, and when he also became aware that Christ was a physician of soul and body in Jerusalem, and that he came calling sinners to repentance, he went forth in confession, and Christ, being so abounding in mercy, literally the bowels of mercy, right? Guts of mercy, he rendered him, Judas, a disciple. But because he knew of the passion, right, the intense flaw of love of money, love of silver, for this reason, Christ gave to him the money box in which were kept all of the funds that were offered for philanthropy, the denarii, and all the funds that were for the consumption of food for the apostles. So Christ deliberately made him the money manager because he knew about his flaw, his love of money. The text says, and he, Judas, would steal from these funds and would send them to his wife and to his children. Now, that's where that text trails off. Quite shocking content, right, with the element of incest and with fratricide, and this idea that Christ knew all of this and still took him in. I think very few people know that backstory about Judas Iscariot. Now, this is from a separate textual source. That's the end of that manuscript. But this tells us details about Judas Iscariot's death that goes beyond the biblical account. And it's quite important because it reconciles that apparent contradiction that I mentioned between the Gospel of Matthew and the book of Acts, where it seems Matthew has him throw the coins back to the high priest, the Sanhedrin, before committing suicide, whereas the book of Acts, written by Luke, seems to imply that he buys a plot of land, farms it for a while, and then his guts explode on that plot of land, which, how do you reconcile these varying accounts? Well, the answer comes to us from a certain St. Papias, an apostolic father, very early church writer, an extra-biblical source, of course, preserved indirectly through the writings of Apollinaris of Laodicea, which are in turn preserved in several other patristic sources that have actually come down to us. But the text is extracted here, and I'll give a live translation. Judas did not actually die by means of the noose, but rather he survived and was taken down before he asphyxiated hanging. And this is shown by the Acts of the Apostles, which say that he fell face down and his middle section burst open and all of his guts spilled out. And this is narrated very clearly by Papias, whom I just mentioned, right? That's the ultimate source of this information. The text says, narrated clearly by Papias, who was a disciple of John, i.e. St. John the theologian, the evangelist, right, who wrote the Gospel of John. This disciple of John, Papias, who says these things in a particular tome of his text called the Explanation of the Sayings of the Lord, the fourth tome thereof. And another fragment preserved that's containing information that's ultimately sourced from this St. Papias of Hierapolis says the following. He was an example of great impiety in this world, in the way he walked. And Judas swelled up a great deal in his flesh, so much so that he was not even capable of easily entering a cart, as in one drawn by mules or horses, and he was not capable of passing through due to his swollenness. And it was specifically due to the swelling of his head. So he had like hydrocephalus. And it's also specified that his eyelids were so swollen with edema that he could not see the light at all. And that even a doctor could not inspect his eyes using an implement because the eyelids are so swollen and they're actually like enclosed. So obviously there's a symbolism to this pathology, right? Because he, the one who sold the light himself, right, is cut off from vision, from light. So deep was like his eyeball from the surface due to the swelling, the text says. And it also adds that his genitalia were particularly disgusting and seemed much greater than they were initially on account of the swelling. And from all of his body was spilling out ichor, that is like goo, and also worms. And then it also says that after many tortures and punishments in his own plot of land, he died. Right, so the plot of land that he bought with the silvers, that he assumedly must have regathered from the ground when he threw them at the high priest, according to the Gospel of Matthew, because he took those silvers and bought land. And so he died, and the area became totally non-inhabited as a result of the foul smell, up until the present time, says Papias, who's, a disciple of the disciples, so he's right after the time of the event. And even up until today, no one is able even to pass through this place if they do not block their nostrils with their hands. For so great was the pouring out and the explosion of his flesh upon the earth. Now, we've heard Papias, St. Papias of Hierapolis, this apostolic father, a source preserved indirectly, but ultimately from the time right after the apostolic writings, very early source. And we had that medieval manuscript, but that seems to preserve, I would say, an oral tradition that's much older, and that probably goes back genuinely to the ancient times. If you recall, the manuscript begins with that, a certain wise man said. So it's not ascribed a particular authorship, but I think that opening phrase is kind of indicative of the fact that it's an oral tradition. And just because something's written down late doesn't necessarily mean that it's a late fabrication, as modern scholarship typically presumes. But what I want to briefly comment on is the fact that this tale, even though very, very few people on the streets or just generally, even in academia, frankly, know that the tale that I narrated to you from that medieval manuscript, it was taught in Ottoman era Greece. So just circumstantially, I was once reading the recorded homilies. They're called didache, didaches, in modern Greek, the teachings of a certain Saint Cosmas the Aetolian. Aetolia is a region in central Greece, just down from Epirus. And this figure, Cosmas the Aetolian, a saint of the Eastern Orthodox Church, he was a preacher. He kind of reinstituted the Greek language as a liturgical language and reinstituted Christian worship in the region of Aetolia and further north in Epirus, in what's modern day Albania, because Christians had kind of lapsed and stopped practicing their religion, presumably under Ottoman influence. And so through his preaching, he was kind of bringing about a rejuvenation of the faith in the 1700s. And he's very famous for prophecies. But aside from prophecies, he also has these teachings that are written down. As you can see in this icon depicting him preaching, he had a certain stool that he would stand on. As you can see, then he would erect a wooden cross at the sites of his homilies. And you can see a fellow on the left, from our perspective, who's writing down. That's the idea of how his texts were recorded, his homilies. And the reason I make mention of his homilies is because randomly embedded in his homilies that cover very diverse topics, all sorts of random things, even things about how men shouldn't shave, for instance. But amidst all of that, there's actually a modern Greek language prose synopsis of that story that I told you that is sourced from an Athonite manuscript. Now, I'm pretty sure he himself, for a period, studied and dwelt on Mt Athos, so he quite possibly read it there or heard it there, or it may have just been part of the oral law of his childhood, for all we know. But at any rate, he tells the whole story there. And the reason I make mention of that is simply because many people will view the story I narrated to you about incest and murder quite contemptuously and presume that it has no place in Christian tradition. But as you can see from this reference, this sainted figure of the Eastern Orthodox Church, who was a folk preacher of the 1700s, the fact that he was telling the story in the exact same format, albeit condensed and translated into the vernacular, obviously you didn't read it in the ancient language, goes to show you that this story was very much alive. Now, as you can see from this image, as a side note, another depiction of him preaching on a stool in front of a cross. He was eventually executed by the Ottoman authorities. He was hanged, but his body was tossed into a river, but it was recovered by the faithful, and his relics are still cherished to our times. But that's just an example of how a story like the story that we saw, the exact same narrative preserved in that medieval manuscript that presumably comes from an old oral tradition, was part and parcel of the lived church life of the 1700s, at least in Ottoman Greece, but no doubt elsewhere as well. And I'm not going to cover them in this video, but there are many Latin texts telling us a similar story at the very least, mentioning even the name of the mother who wasn't mentioned in the Greek recension. In the Latin text, she's called Ciboria. Maybe I'll address them on another day, but they roughly tell the same story. So there are different textual recensions of the same story, but the manuscripts crop up in medieval time. But that doesn't mean that they're not possibly far older, genuinely ancient oral traditions, because not everything was written down, or things that have been written down have perished, right? Many are not persuaded by that rationale, but I just want to briefly dwell on certain examples, let's say, of stories that are extra biblical that have come down to us in strange ways. So an example of this would be that there is a tale. It's found in the so-called infancy gospel of pseudo Matthew. So it's a Latin language text that tells stories about the infancy of Christ and about the flight to Egypt, right? For instance, it has episodes on the flight to Egypt where, like, Saint Mary, Theotokos, Mother of God, whilst on the donkey on the way to Egypt, sees like a vision of two children, like one weeping and one rejoicing, one symbolizing the Gentiles, one symbolizing the nation of Israel, one lamenting the future destruction of the temple and dispersion and all the horrors that await the people, unfortunately, under the Romans, the other child representing the joy of the nations receiving Christianity. And also in that journey, animals, according to Psalmic prophecy, come out and venerate the young Christ. And there's this episode where you actually see depicted here in this mosaic that is from the Capella Palatina in Palermo in modern-day Sicily, in a Norman royal chapel in the city that I've seen firsthand. I was astonished when I saw this mosaic here that you see, because it has Christ commanding a palm tree to bend down so that his mother can get grapes, because she's experiencing consternation about great hunger and thirst on the road on the flight to Egypt. So this infant Christ rebukes the palm tree, makes it bend to feed dates to his mother, and he also causes a river to spill forth from the base of the palm tree. And so you can actually see there on the left a depiction of Joseph and Mary and the young Christ before the date palm with the little river spilling out from under it. And that's actually from a high medieval British manuscript, which is like a biblical picture book. And even though that tale of the date palms is not in the Bible, right, it's in this extra biblical text, namely the Latin language infancy gospel of so-called pseudo Matthew. It was included as an image alongside lots of canonical tales in what is essentially a pictorial Bible. So what this goes to show is, just like this Judas Iscariot story that I've narrated in this video was part of the broader oral Christian culture for centuries, even though people don't know it today, so too there are other stories like this date palm incident of the infant Christ feeding his mother miraculously through a bending date palm and causing a font of water to sprout forth. Stories like that were widely known in early Christianity, worked their way eventually into manuscripts, and even informed high medieval art, as you see on the left, but also high medieval cathedrals and churches like the Royal Chapel, the Capella Palatina in the city of Palermo, Sicily. And you can see it's written in Greek, that mosaic, the text. It says the flight to Egypt. And obviously it was Greek artisans, but working also with Arabs, because there's geometric Arabian motifs in that chapel as well, in Sicilian architecture. And it was also a Latin liturgical context, because it was Norman, and the Norman regime was responsible for actually slowly changing the culture of Sicily from Byzantine Greek to, Latinate or Romance, right? And I've also included there a Quranic kind of illustration, presumably from Persia, I would say, of Mary and the date palm tree, because rather astonishingly, if you don't know, perhaps, but this story of the infant Christ making the palm tree bend to feed dates to his mother is also told in the Quran. So that's another instance of wide-ranging oral culture of these ancient tales making its way into various textual traditions. So another example of that phenomenon would be the fact that in the Quran, in the Surah Al-Ma'idah, pardon my non-existent Arabic, but it also narrates an episode where the young Christ picks up clay and crafts birds and breathes life into them and animates them, which obviously harkens back to Genesis and God breathing life into the earth, Adamah, to make Adam, right? So here Christ creates life just as God the Father does. And this tale is told quite famously in the infancy gospel of Thomas, which is a very wild text, which I might narrate on another day, but it has some quite controversial content in it. It was pretty heretical, yet nonetheless survives in very many manuscript recensions, which were quite popular in medieval times, as you can see by the fact that we have a Switzerland church's mural here, showing the scene of Christ animating the birds. But I should reiterate that even though the Gospel of Thomas is quite controversial and was quite rightly deemed like heretical by mainstream church authority, there are infancy Gospels that have this same episode of the young Christ animating the birds, like the Arabic infancy Gospel, which are kind of freed from all of those nasty elements that make the Gospel of Thomas heretical. So no doubt, with all these different textual recensions, it's typically argued by modern scholarship that the Gospel of Thomas is older than the other versions of text telling the story, which is possible, but it might not be the case. Who really knows? I don't know how they really determine these things. It seems quite arbitrary. But what's for certain is that this story of Christ as a child animating birds, even though it's not in the Bible, it was very popular iconographically. And no doubt, I think there's really good reason to believe that it goes back to the actual early oral law of Christianity. In fact, there are examples of stories that are not in the Bible and even not in any extant text that I'm aware of, but that were part of Christian oral tradition. So, for instance, my grandmother, who grew up in a very isolated town and was barely literate but was part of a rich oral culture, was told a story by either her parish priest or a hero monk passing through the area. I'm not exactly sure, but some church authority in her early life told her this story that she related to me. She never cited a source, so it's oral law. But as you'll see from the story that I'm about to tell, it quite clearly has the trappings of an authentically ancient story. It could be that there is a text out there that I have failed to find, but it could also be that it's just purely oral. At any rate, the story she told me, so I'm going to share this to you. This is a rare opportunity for you to actually receive a story that is basically, as far as I'm aware, not recorded anywhere else. And that could theoretically, rather than being a folklore creation, even be perhaps a tale passed by word of mouth that genuinely goes back all the way to ancient times, in the manner of these other stories here that we've been assessing that do have textual records. But so in this oral tale that she told me, the disciples were walking apparently with Christ, apparently to Jericho, and they weren't sure of the way. And Christ, despite being, divine and omniscient, did not feel the need to provide any direction and just let them be lost. And they approached a fellow asking for directions, and he was a cowherd, right? He was a cowboy, so to speak. And they asked for directions to Jericho, and he listfully lifted his leg and pointed it in a direction without much consideration. Said, yeah, it's that way, whatever, and dismissed them. And they started going that way, and they went a long way that way, and they started becoming unsure whether this was the right direction. And they eventually encountered a young lady, and they asked her for directions. And she said, oh, sorry, dear chaps, but you've actually very much gone the wrong way. You're supposed to go this way. But come in, I'll give you refreshments, and I'll set you back on the right path and direct you towards Jericho. And so she took great care of them, and she walked a long way with them, putting them back on the right path. She really went out of her way, disrupted her day to help them. And then she departed, and they parted ways, and the disciples say to Christ, well, what a lovely woman. Whoever marries her is going to be truly blessed. She's, so considerate, such a stunning example of virtue. And Christ says, well, disciples, that woman will marry the cowherd who was rude to us earlier and sent us the wrong way. And the disciples kind of shred their garments. They're like, what do you mean? This is outrageous. And he says, well, such is the nature of providence, that, noble people are paired with not so noble people for their betterment, and such is the best arrangement. And so obviously the point of this parabolic story is to, help people deal with their marital problems. It's quite an interesting tale, and it seems kind of in line with general teachings that you'll find in writings of characters, but church fathers like St. John Chrysostom and the like. So that's pretty cool. It's a rare oral story that I thought I would share with you that may, as I say, genuinely go back to ancient times. So Another example of such a tale that was passed on to me orally by my grandmother, who obviously had access to some pretty rare lore. Another such tale that she passed on to me, I actually did find a medieval paper record of it, but in a most unexpected place. So, despite the fact that this grandmother was located in the region of Aetolia, right, essentially central Greece, she told me this story that I'm going to now relate to you that is also found in the Persian language writings of a rather famous Persian poet called Nizami Ganjavi. So he's actually from what is now modern day Azerbaijan, even though he was writing in Persian. So he was born around 1141 AD and died around 1209 AD. And I've produced two illuminated manuscripts of his work that show the story that I'm about to tell. Rather than using his story, version of the story, I'm going to tell the oral version that I received from my grandmother. But nonetheless, it's pretty much identical to the way he tells the tale too. You can look it up. It's from his text called "The Treasury of Secrets." But the story goes that Christ and the disciples were walking, and they encountered a rotten dead dog. And the stench was apparently very foul, and the apostles did not want to contaminate themselves, and with ritual impurity, and they hated the foul stench, and they were all complaining about it. But nonetheless, oddly, Christ stepped forward and approached the dead dog. He said, "What are you doing, Master?" And he bent over it and he pried open its mouth, and they were all scandalized. And Christ said, "Come closer." And they were hesitant, but he insisted, "Come closer." And they approached the dead body of this dog, and he showed them the white teeth, the pearl white teeth. And he said, "Do you see these teeth that are white like pearls?" And they said, "Yes, but what's your point?" He said, "Well, see, even in a stinking cadaver, even amidst all this rot and death and foulness, there is still goodness and beauty." So that's like kind of the punchline, right? The teaching at play here is that even in the most foul of circumstances, where it seems as if God's providence is absent, even therein one can encounter great beauty if they have the kind of patience and audacity to seek it. So that's a pretty cool tale. You can interestingly see on that Persian manuscript, Christ is actually on a donkey in this case. And their attire is rather odd too, with the hats and the turbans and so on. But how fascinating that this story told in Aetolia, Greece, orally over centuries, is also found in the Persian tradition in what we might call the High Medieval era, roughly the same time that the story of Judas Iscariot that I earlier translated was written out on Mount Athos. And if you recall, the opening lines of that Mount Athos text about Judas Iscariot's backstory was, "A certain wise man once said." So the point of me raising these other random oral stories and then showing how they're also recorded in random medieval manuscripts across the globe is just to get us all thinking about how it is exactly that stories can come down to us and how they can be oral for a long time before being written down in the medieval era. But that doesn't notionally mean that they were medieval concoctions, as academics so often presume. It's possible that they were merely oral for a long time before being written down. And of course, the written versions that we have are not necessarily the oldest. And sometimes what comes down to us in writing is purely coincidental. I mean, is it the case that this Persian story made its way to Ottoman Greece and that it's a Persian concoction? And that's how my grandmother came to know it, despite her not knowing any Persian or Turkish? Possibly, possibly. But is it not also likely that it simply was a living ancient oral story that survived orally in continental Greece for a very long time and also made its way across to Persia and got incorporated into Islam? I mean, is that not possible in the same manner as the bird story that we saw earlier? Seems quite likely if you ask me. At any rate, as we kind of now approach the end of the video, I just wanted to bring up yet one more peculiar, primarily oral story that is only recorded in very late writing. And it's interesting because it typologically resembles the story of Judas Iscariot that we dealt with in this video to a very high degree in many typological features. But instead, the story is about Joshua of Nun. And in case you don't know, Nun in Aramaic/Hebrew means like fish or eel, but probably fish, right? So This story is only found in the writings, as far as paper recordings are concerned, it's only found in the writings of a certain rabbi, Abraham Vilna, who I think is from Lithuania or thereabouts, um, Eastern Europe, Eastern European Ashkenazi Jew. And he records this tale that was obviously an oral midrash, and who knows how old it is, right? It's really open to question. People are quite dismissive of it and presume that it's a late accretion. But as we'll see from the general contours of the story, I think there's significant reason to presume that it may actually be quite old. At any rate, what is the story? So the story is that a baby was born in Egypt when the Hebrews were enslaved there. This is the time of Moses, right? And there was a prophecy that the child that had just been born would kill his own father. And so to avoid this from occurring, the mother placed the child inside a basket, placed him in the waters, presumably the Nile, and a huge fish consumed the baby in the basket. Then a fisherman of the Pharaoh caught this large fish. It was amazing, and so they wanted to go and show the size of this monstrous fish to the Pharaoh. They brought it to him. He decided to have a banquet. They cut it open, and out arose living this miraculous child. Everyone was astonished, and so the child was adopted, and the child became the head executioner of the court of the Pharaoh. Okay, and then as head executioner of the Pharaoh, one time the child's actual biological father got into trouble and was presented before the Pharaoh and was condemned, and so the son, the boy who was the son of the fish because his father was not known, his actual father, right? So that's why he was Yehoshua ben Nun, the Joshua, God is salvation, the son of the fish was his name. Obviously, there's some interesting typological parallels to Christ, whose symbol was the fish, right? The Holy Grail. A grail is a fish dish. But at any rate, return to this Hebrew story. Joshua, son of Nun, is so called because he's from the fish, and he ends up fulfilling the prophecy about him by killing his own father. Now, there is some, though this story is only recorded, as I said, in the 1700s in writing, there is speculation, if I recall correctly, in the Talmud about why it is that the Torah does not list any genealogy like for Joshua of Nun. He doesn't have descendants. Which is quite unusual for such a major figure, like tribal figure, leader. And there is speculation in the Talmud about the fact that he cut off a head, and it's interpreted in the sense of he ended his lineage by not having children. That's one particular speculation. And of course, the Talmud has many speculations in it. But you can see that the element of cutting off the head probably informs this midrashic tale about him being an executioner, cutting off the head of his own father. Right? And that might account for why he's cursed with no offspring. But that's just one speculative tradition, right? In another portion of the Talmud, the Megillah 14b, there, even though it's said that even though the Torah does not specify that Joshua, son of Nun, had further descendants, the rabbis there speculate, in fact, that he did have children through the prostitute Rahab, and that one important ancestor was the female prophetess Huldah. And so I've extracted the relevant line from this passage of the Talmud, and it says, Amar Rav Nachman, and Rabbi Nachman said that Huldah, from the sons of his son, that is, of Joshua, it is written there that a son of Charchas, and is written that, and is written elsewhere that this is not in the text. I'm just adding in this for explanation. But he, i.e., Joshua of Nun, was buried in a place called Timnat Cheres. So what's the significance of this? So two random lines from the Hebrew Bible are selected. Now, there are two sites for the burial of Joshua of Nun in the Bible. One, I think, is given in the book of Joshua, and then the other in the book of Judges. And I think this quote here from the rabbis takes the version from the book of Judges, where the place name for the tomb of Joshua is given as Timnat Cheres. And the Chares is being connected here to a certain Ben Charchas, a certain son of Charchas, who's written up elsewhere in the genealogy of the prophetess Huldah. So she was the wife of Shalom, who in turn was the son of a certain Tikva, who was a son of Charchas. So the Charchas in the lineage of Huldah's, the prophet Huldah's house, is being connected to the Cheres in the toponym, the place name, Timnat Cheres, which is where Joshua of Nun was buried. So it's this claim that through this common naming element between the tomb and member of the genealogy of the prophetess Huldah, that's the ancestral connection. And I've pasted there some images of the tomb of Caleb on the left and the tomb of Joshua, son of Nun himself. And there's also actually a tomb of Nun, Mr. Fish, so to speak, that's in the same location as well, that I believe is in the West Bank. And there's another quote here from the Talmud that, and it is written in one place, Ben Tikva, a certain son of Tikva, which, as I said, is a figure from the genealogy of the prophetess Huldah, and his name is Tikva. And then it is written in another place, Et Tikvat Chut Chashani. So what that means is that a crimson like thread and rope was suspended. So that's a quote. The rabbis of the Talmud there are quoting the famous scene from the book of Joshua, where the spies are sent into the land on behalf of Moses to, observe whether it's worth conquering, and they famously bring back a huge cluster of grapes, which church fathers deemed to have great typological significance for the Eucharist and so on. But this passage is concerned with this Tikva element. So Tikva is the name of that character in the genealogy of Huldah, the alleged descendant of Joshua of Nun. Okay, and Tikvat is the word for like the scarlet thread that was, famously the prostitute Rahab invited Joshua of Nun and Caleb, the spies of the Israelites, into her tower dwelling that was on the walls of Jericho when they were planning to take that city, and she housed them and she asked to be spared. And of course, she famously was spared. So there's this typological element that Joshua of Nun's line, as in his genealogy, his descendants, come from his marrying of this prostitute. And the reason that's typologically significant is there are certain parallels between this Joshua marrying the Tikva, right, the crimson thread lady. Of course, the church fathers allegorically connect the crimson thread to like the blood of the Eucharist. And it's linked to the Samaritan woman in the Gospel of John, in later tradition identified as Saint Fatina, whom Christ kind of typologically marries. And, he mentions that she's had these 5 husbands that are typically understood as in light of a certain passage from 2 Kings, where it's said that the king of Assyria brought men from Babylon, from Kutha, from Ava, from Hamat, and from Sepharvaim, and those are of course make up 5 settlements, and place them in Samaria. So the idea is that in the book of Hosea, that's addressed to the northern kingdom, who will become the Samaritans, who are the mixed in northern Israelites and Babylonian, like that's their seed. She, this Samaritan woman here by the well, kind of symbolizes the population of northern Israel who went a-whoring after idols, was rebuked by the prophet Hosea, but the prophet Hosea, the paraclete speaking through him, so to speak, in ecclesiastical language, promised that God would remarry the Samaritan nation as a bride. And so that typologically seen as being fulfilled in the case of the Samaritan woman. And I just bring that up in relation to the Joshua of Nun story, because there's that common element, right, of the hero Yehoshua, right, Joshua, or Jesus. Of course, Jesus of Nun is called Jesus in the Greek Bible, in the Septuagint. And so here he marries this Samaritan woman who's had the 5 nations, the 5 husbands to whom she's offered herself. And incidentally, I've got the mosaic there from the Capella Palatina that shows Paul and Peter looking upwards at demons dropping Simon Magus onto the earth. And that's a scene, again, an extra biblical scene that's taken from a text called the Acts of Peter and Paul, where Peter and Paul are before Nero, the emperor, who's also depicted in that same chapel on a mosaic. And Simon Magus is kind of winning the favor of Nero by claiming he can perform great deeds, and he claims he can fly, and he does so with the help of demons. But through prayer, Peter and Paul command the demons to let him go, and he drops to the ground and splats, right? Rather famously. And the reason that tale is worth telling is simply because in the church fathers' accounts of the life of Simon Magus, I think particularly in the account of Saint Irenaeus, but I think it's told elsewhere, it's mentioned in passing that Simon Magus actually characterized himself as Menelaus, and he identified a certain woman as a certain Helen, the story of the Trojan War. And he married this certain woman who was a prostitute and claimed that it was necessary for him to marry this prostitute for the redemption of humanity. And he, of course, famously, according to the church fathers, claimed that he would rise from the dead. But of course, his tomb was guarded and nothing occurred, and he was found to be a liar. And he apparently, according to heresiological accounts, claimed to be like an incarnation of the Holy Spirit, the Paraclete. But what's interesting is he too, in his story, tries to incorporate this element of marrying the prostitute. But unlike Jesus, the two Jesuses, the two Joshuas, who typologically take on covenantally marry their respective prostitutes, Simon Magus didn't quite pull it off as well, did he? So at any rate, the point of today, the point of me telling all these other extra biblical stories, in addition to the text about Judas Iscariot, that was the main focus, was simply to kind of contextualize that story in case you've never ever encountered extra biblical stories before, and to just start to get a rich appreciation for the rich oral law that exists generally surrounding the Bible, and that a sola scriptura kind of outlook is a rather poor one, in that it overlooks all the rich oral law that's actually been a part of, the life of religious folk through the ages. And if you happen to be interested in this story, I've actually done a much deeper dive wherein I connect a lot of the typological features of the Judas Iscariot story to Greco-Roman mythology and a wider picture of universal history. And that may be of interest to you, so you can go and find that on my channel. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed the talk, and I'll see you next time.